Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Professor Alvaro Mendez. I'm the director of the LSE Global South Unit and a senior research fellow here at LSE Ideas. I'm very happy and excited about today's seminar. This is a dialogue series. This is the third one that we have organized this year. And this is co-organized by the LSE Global South Unit and LSE Ideas. And we examine how the Global South engages in a changing international order, bringing forward perspectives that are often underrepresented and sometimes not in the literature. Today's session is great, going to be great. It's called The Global South in the Age of Trump. Invites us to reflect on how rising powers respond to an evolving geopolitical landscape and what this means for global governance. Of course, there are headlines every single day on this. We will have a very interesting analysis by Dr. Rohan Mukherjee, who we are honored to have. He's assistant professor in the Department of International Relations here at the LSE, and he's the deputy director of LSE Ideas. His research I'm sure familiar with, but he examines how emerging powers navigate hierarchies of power and status in international order. He wrote an award-winning book called Ascending Order, Rising Powers and the Politics of Status in International Institutions by Cambridge University Press, which has received multiple international prizes. Joining him as a moderator and discussant, Professor Gregory T. Chin is Associate Professor of Political Economy at York University and a long-standing collaborator of us and the Global South Unit. He's a leading scholar on global political economy. With recent work, he published China and the Global Economic Order, co-authored with Kevin Gallagher, published, I believe, just last week. So congratulations, Greg, for this. His research has appeared in Global Governance, Review of International Political Economy, Global Policy, and Third World Quarterly, and he's widely recognized for his expertise on new development banks, including the AIB and the NDB. I have had the honor of working with Professor Chin for several years. Before we begin with Rohan's remarks, I want to note that this dialogue series is sponsored by the Spanish Ministry of Economy and Competitiveness. So we're very grateful to that project. And today's structure is as follows. We open the floor for Rohan for approximately 25-30 minutes. Then we will have a moderated discussion with Professor Chin. And finally, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. Please submit your questions in the chat, and we will organize them when we come to that point towards the end. A quick announcement that our next webinar is going to be held on December the 11th at 2 p.m. UK time. It will be on China and Africa and lessons for Latin America with Professor Chris Alden from LSE as the main speaker. We hope that you can join us for this particular event. Thank you for being here. Without further delay, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rohan Mukherjee. Thank you very much, Rohan.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my slides. I hope everyone can see that. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
we can.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Alvaro. Thank you, Greg. It's wonderful to be here. And thank you, Dave Sutton, for organizing this on behalf of LSE Ideas as well, and the team at the Global South Unit. So I just wanted to sort of, I'll just dive in here. Basically, I was going to talk about three things, if this can actually move forward. Here we go. Initially, I just want to talk a little bit about terminology, right? Because I think there's a lot of disagreement over whether the Global South is really a term that we should be using, and what are the sort of challenges of that. There's also this idea of whether the world is multipolar or not. There's a big debate around that. I then want to talk about the BRICS as an institution that has risen to, or let's say a coalition of countries that has risen with a claim to representing the Global South, even though that may not always be the case. Sorry, there's and then I also want to talk about the Global South in the age of Trump. How are Global South countries, particularly the BRICS countries, but also other countries, responding to the U.S. leadership under President Donald Trump? So that's sort of the overall structure of this talk. And really, when I talk about the Global South and the BRICS in particular, there's largely this sort of rise of this concept and the BRICS as a coalition and their appeal because of what I would argue is a growing frustration with the so-called rules-based order among countries that are not within the Western core of that order. And in this sense, terms like the Global South and multipolarity are better thought of as aspirational and political terms that capture a desired state of the world rather than necessarily what actually exists today. And I think they represent more broadly a decline in Western legitimacy when it comes to global leadership, but not necessarily outright decline in Western power, because the US still remains a militarily powerful country, the most powerful country in the world, and a major economic player in many aspects ahead of China still. And then, of course, Trump has come along and upended many traditional understandings that we have of how things work in the international system. So I'll cover that as well. Okay. So, sorry, this is so talking about terminology, the standard definition really is based on sort of economic difference, which is traditionally the global north is distinguished from the global south in terms of being the realm of developed versus developing economies. It's often the simplest way to categorize these countries. It captures something important about being global south, which is economic weakness, relatively speaking, historical underperformance, but also one that is rooted in being outside the West, right? In a certain non-Western identity and a post-colonial status in the 20th century and now 21st century. So there is therefore something here that is captured by these kind of terminologies, and there is much discussion about whether the global South is a useful concept. Now, there are obviously people have argued there are many differences between global South countries. There's no coherence in the concept. There's no solidarity between them per se. And most of this criticism comes from the West or some parts of the non-West that are frequently, sort of in touch with Western thinkers and so on. And yet, globally, interest in the global South continues to rise, right? Even especially if you look at sort of worldwide Google searches that I've shown here from over the last 10 years, you see that since around mid 2020, and increasingly since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there has been a substantial and steady increase in interest in the term Global South. The average monthly popularity of the search term Global South on Google since February 2022 is up by 63% compared to the 5 years before the invasion, right? So that's something very interesting, and we should also remember that Google is not typically commonly used in China, for example. So this is perhaps an underestimate of the interest in the term globally. And the Global South, despite this loose definition and inherent contradictions, has become a political rallying point for countries that sought to remain broadly non-aligned in that conflict, the Ukraine conflict. And so, in some sense, whether we like it or not, the term is in vogue, and it is as cohesive or uncohesive as past concepts such as the third world, the developing world, the non-West, or even the West, I would argue. And even though the term Global South is criticized and dismissed by many commentators in the West, it holds political significance as an organizing principle for many countries in less economically developed parts of the world that share that history of being colonized and being outside the core of the international order. There's also disagreement about whether we live in a multipolar world or not. This is the results of a 2023 survey by the magazine Foreign Affairs of international relations practitioners and experts in the United States mostly. It had 68 respondents, and of which 65% disagreed or strongly disagreed that the world is unipolar, right? And only 23% agreed, while 12% were neutral. And you can see a sort of declining slope here where those who think the world is unipolar are less confident in their view than those who think that the world is not unipolar, that it is somehow bipolar or multipolar. And so when I teach, I ask this question to my students and I survey them. And over the summer, I had an N of 40 students in my class, and 82% of them said the world is multipolar, right? So there's a strong feeling in the public, I would say, and among experts that unipolarity is over and that we are trending towards something else. But is that something else multipolarity, right? That is an important question as well, that is tied to the notion of global south and the emergence of BRICS and so on. Now, one way to measure the changing distribution of power globally is pure relative economic power. So this graph shows the shares of global GDP attributable to the United States, to the G7 minus the US, and the rest of the world, and then the BRICS, right, in different colors from 1992 to 2024. So end of the Cold War-ish till the present. And the dark blue at the bottom is the US, the orange above that is BRICS, the green is G7 minus America, and the blue is the rest. And what you start to see over time from between this period is that the US has actually maintained a relatively stable share of the global economy, while other G7 members have seen their shares shrink. So we're talking about Canada, France, UK, Italy, Germany, and Japan. The rest of the world in the light blue has also been relatively stable over time. The main increase has been for the BRICS in orange, right? So there has perhaps been something here, something has happened regarding BRICS as a group of powerful global South states, minus Russia. Russia is not in the global South, that seeks to represent the voice of the global South and the interests of the global South in global governance. But in fact, the BRICS story is largely a China story, right? If you take China out separately and you plot it, in the same time span with regard to share of world GDP, you see that actually the rest of the countries in BRICS are pretty much constant. And it's really China that drives the rise and changing shares of global GDP. And so really, instead of multipolarity, perhaps what the world really is tending towards is bipolarity in a pure structural sense, which is, economically and militarily and so on. And yet, BRICS as a concept seems to capture the imagination of politicians, of policymakers, and analysts the world over. Right? So why is this the case? And here I would argue it's arguably because the so-called liberal rules-based order has not delivered results equally for all countries in the international system. And this has created a sense of dissatisfaction among countries that are lower down the global hierarchy. So one way of thinking about this is looking at per capita GDP, which here is measured in constant prices. This is data from the World Bank, measured from the end of the Cold War, again around 1990 to the present. So the green line is high income countries, the orange is middle income, and the blue is low income countries. And it's immediately obvious that high income countries have done well in the post Cold War era. They have the average per capita income among them has gone from 25,000 to somewhere over $40,000. This is about an increase of almost two times, almost doubling, say 1.7. Um, and middle income countries have actually done even better, right? Their per capita income has gone from about $1,700 to $6,000. So that's an increase of about three and a half times. But low income countries are actually stagnant. Their per capita income has not changed in this entire period of 30 years, 35, very long period of time, right? And so, in some sense, there is a significant difference here in how countries are benefiting or not benefiting from the global system. We can also see this in poverty rates. So here we have the different World Bank poverty rates based on different minimum levels of income per day, $3, 4.2, and $8 a day, measured in just two snapshots, 2013 and 2023, which is when data was available for. There's unfortunately no data here for the middle income countries, but what's immediately obvious when you compare the low and the high income countries is that the proportion of individuals living in poverty by any measure is actually higher today than it was 10 years ago in these countries, right? So people are measurably worse off. Their per capita incomes are stagnant, whereas things have improved in high income countries, and I would imagine, have improved even more in middle income countries who are truly benefiting a great deal from this current order. And so there is definitely this growing inequality. And this is precisely the inequality that BRICS countries have sought to sort of uh, not necessarily weaponize, but use as a political instrument in furthering their own cause in the international system. And so the persistent inequality experienced by low income and lower middle income countries has created fertile ground for politics of the global south as practiced by the BRICS countries. And so the BRICS agenda, as a result, is focused on things like sovereignty, mutual respect, equality between countries, things that traditionally countries have not experienced in the international order. They seek to reform global governance institutions, including the UN Security Council and international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. They have sought to reduce their economic dependence on the West through new initiatives like the New Development Bank and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. These are not heavily capitalized initiatives. They actually have far less paid up capital than traditional institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, the ADB, and so on. But they are meant to sort of be venues in which the BRICS countries can at least be in charge. And the NDB at least operates on a one country, one vote principle, unlike the traditional IFIs, which have voting rights tied to economic power. So there are differences here in terms of governance as well. There's of course then an emphasis on South-South cooperation and solidarity, and also cooperation on specific public goods globally in terms of climate change, counterterrorism, and other areas. So there is, in a sense, an effort here to capitalize on this frustration among less fortunate countries in the international system who have not done as well as others, and to say that they should have a stronger voice, right? And you see the effects of this in actual policy when you look at how BRICS countries, the more powerful countries in the global south, in not just BRICS but also countries like Indonesia and Egypt, have reacted to major moments like the Ukraine war, right? So this was a moment where the West, under the Biden administration at least, was heavily invested, and we saw very different responses from these countries in terms from the West, right? So China and Russia obviously declared a no limits partnership less than a month before the invasion of Ukraine, and this statement explicitly linked Russia's opposition to NATO expansion and China's position on Taiwan. And since the invasion of Ukraine, of course, as is well known, China has provided diplomatic cover for Russia in multilateral forums. It has increasingly supplied components that aid in the manufacture of Russian weapons and has continued trading with Russia in a major way. India and its political leadership has consistently argued that the West is being hypocritical in its insistence on globally coordinated actions against Russia when the West has rarely acted decisively to solve conflicts in the global South, and in fact has made them worse through its involvement. So, Foreign Minister Jaishankar, who's shown here in the top middle of the top row, he said famously in June 2022 that Europe has to grow out of the mindset that its problems are the world's problems. And then, the leaders of Brazil and Indonesia, shown in the lower two panels, have offered peace plans that were deeply dissatisfying to Ukraine and the West. Both these plans would have required Ukraine to give up territory and were therefore unacceptable. And whether they were serious or not, they at least signaled a weariness with the conflict among these countries in the global south. And finally, there were reports that countries like Egypt considered selling rockets to Russia but decided against it due to US pressure, and that South Africa provided an arms shipment to Moscow. So clearly taken together, many countries in the global south have acted quite independently and out of line with Western positions on something as important as the Ukraine war. The UN General Assembly offers another lens through which we can see this. So this map shows how countries voted in the six resolutions brought against Russia at the General Assembly after the invasion in 2022 and 2023. Things subsequently changed in 2024, in 2025, when the Trump administration came into power and sponsored different resolutions. So I'm not going to look at those, but just to look at the initial six resolutions that sought to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. You can see basically in this map that the countries marked in dark green always voted against Russia and for Ukraine on all those six resolutions. So these are basically the West and its allies, plus a few countries like Myanmar, Papua New Guinea, and so on. The countries in red voted with Russia and against Ukraine in all six resolutions. So there are only four countries in this category: Russia, Belarus, Syria, and North Korea. The countries in light green are broadly Ukraine aligned, so they did not vote always for Ukraine, but did so in at least four out of the six votes. And the countries in light pink similarly are broadly Russia aligned. There are only, again, two countries in this category, Eritrea and Nicaragua. And so, and then there's a small group of countries that are marked in gray, which engaged in some mix of voting with one side or the other or abstaining. But the most interesting category for our purposes is marked in orange. These are countries whose majority of votes were either abstentions or no votes at all, right? So these are countries that were firmly committed to not taking a position on the issue. And as we can see from the map, all of them are in what we would call the global south, and most of them are in Africa and Asia. So there's something here that there's clearly an effect here of being a global south country and having a certain position or desire to not have a position on this conflict. And you can see this even more clearly if you look at which countries in the world were members of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. So this is not the non-aligned movement after the Cold War when many other countries joined, including China. This is the original membership of the non-aligned movement until the end of the Cold War. And there's something here again about being a global south country that was part of this movement that creates a tendency to have mixed feelings. So you can see the lineages of what we call the global south politically also traveling through concepts like the third world and the non-aligned group of countries. And so the group has, of course, expanded, but one has to account in a sense for historical tendencies growing out of decolonization and third world solidarity to understand the global response to the international order and things like the war on Ukraine. So this map, of course, overlaps with those who chose not to take much of a side in at the UN against Russia. Finally, what does this all mean in terms of the age of Donald Trump as the president of the U.S., the most powerful country in the world, the guarantor of the international order until recently, and so on? The rise of Trump has upended much of what we thought we knew about how leaders act in international politics and how international relations actually takes place, both from a practitioner point of view, but also from an academic point of view. We used to think that allies, especially US allies, enjoyed special relationships with each other and that states have every incentive to signal commitment to their allies. Instead, Trump has at every turn threatened to abandon US allies if they don't increase their defense spending and do more of what the US wants. We used to think that great powers pose threats to each other when they expand or have expansionist tendencies, and the expansionist tendencies of one power would be met with balancing and pushback from others. Now, Trump has accommodated Russia's position on Ukraine and has instead leaned on Ukraine to make concessions in order to achieve a peace agreement. So there's selective accommodation of adversaries. There's also a lot to be said about the administration's approach to China and how it may be different from its predecessors. On trade, we used to think that free trade was desirable for all countries because the theory of comparative advantage showed that everyone would benefit from an open, rules-based trading system. But Trump has imposed large tariffs on all countries in an effort to go back in time and turn the US once again into a manufacturing powerhouse and an exporter to the world. And we used to think of American exceptionalism as grounded in a belief in the US as a force for good in the world. Despite the many bad outcomes of this belief, there was a certain feeling that America was, among American elites, that the US's presence in the world was one to sort of promote freedom and democracy and human rights and other values that the US seemed to care about. At this point, American elites seem to care little for the world and would like to see America first on every policy issue. Right? From security to migration to trade and the environment, it has been a complete inversion of the traditional exceptionalism of the United States. And so, what all of this adds up to then is a fundamental rejection of the core principles, rules, and institutions of the liberal and international order that the US has led since 1945. And this order was based on a simple social contract. Other countries would accept US global leadership in return for global public goods provided by the US and its great power allies, with the US bearing a disproportionate cost for maintaining that order or its international rules and organizations. But today there's a growing feeling in US politics, in domestic politics, that this order has benefited other countries, especially China, more than it has benefited the US and the American people. And it is therefore, quote unquote, a bad deal that has to be reformed to focus squarely on US interests or to be thrown out entirely. And so the international order is changing. The Western core of this order is divided. The US and the EU no longer agree on things like important issues like support for Ukraine, on the importance of NATO, on the role of Russia and the threat it poses to Europe, and even on how to approach China. So there are important divisions have emerged between the West in the Western core. The US itself has exited from hegemony, so a lot of people who studied international order were very interested in what would happen with the rise of new powers. Would China and India preserve the order, destroy it, transform it? Very few people were thinking about what would happen when the architect of the order itself decides to withdraw from it and start to dismantle it. And the US has done this in many ways, multilateral, bilateral, unilateral, and so on. There's also been democratic decline. A core pillar of the liberal order has now, started eroding within the West, but also in other countries such as India, Turkey, Brazil, and other places. Authoritarian systems seem to be doing well, and then there are increasingly frequent periods of lurching between two different types of leadership, authoritarian or otherwise, even within democratic systems. And then, unilateralism and bilateral deal making has started to dominate over multilateralism. Every government is rushing to Washington, D.C. for their own deal to reduce the pain of tariffs. And there has been sort of this erosion of multilateralism as a core pillar of the order. And capitalism, which was, in the 90s seen as a great threat to state sovereignty, has now been bent to national objectives. Markets must serve the state, both at home and abroad. There is a rise of protectionism, sanctions, securitization of the economy, industrial policy, export controls, all being led by the US. This is no longer the world in which multinational corporations were necessarily feared. This is a much more state-led model of economic management, as has historically been seen in places like East Asia. Though, of course, within the US, big corporations still have, especially big tech, seems to have an inordinate influence on government policy. And finally, military conflicts are rising, right? According to data collected by the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, 2023 saw the highest number of state-based conflicts since 1946. There were 59 conflicts in 34 countries. I think there's been a very recent update to that to count an even higher number of conflicts this year. So we are in an unprecedented time in terms of the post-Cold War era where military conflicts are also higher than they've ever been before. So how have BRICS and Global South countries responded to these changes? An America that is uninterested in global leadership opens up, I would argue, many strategic opportunities for countries that have been waiting in the wings to play this role. They are making their bids for geopolitical influence and status while also being better able to protect themselves from many of the constraints that the more liberal aspects of the order used to place on them. And so they are taking opportunities to exploit Western divisions. China has made overtures to the EU. India has signed an FTA with the EU. There are now gains to be had due to this division between mainly Europe and America. There's also an effort to gain leadership of international organizations. China has made a push at the UN. India is taking leadership on climate change. Brazil seeks to be a major player on trade in its own region. And then there's an attempt to sort of protect what you might call non-liberal values, or even in many cases, illiberal values, right? That there's more space now in a world where the US does not care about democracy promotion, human rights, and other things. But this is also not an entirely rosy picture. The world with Trump as US president is also a much riskier and costlier place for many countries. And many countries are trying to mitigate those risks, therefore, by supporting multilateralism and doubling down on it. So many countries are now saying that the multilateral trading system should be preserved, that climate negotiations should go forward, that trade agreements should be rescued, and even something like NATO deserves great deal of support, right? There's also an effort to diversify economic relations. We have seen this in particular between China and global South countries since the first trade war in 2018 began between the US and China. There has been a sort of a desire to diversify also on the other side away from China in terms of supply chains and all of that in Asia. And finally, there's an effort to build and expand coalitions to create alternative sources of influence and status that can help shore up the positions of these major countries that are not in the Western core. So institutions like BRICS, IBSA, the SCO, the AIIB, the New Development Bank, there's a host of new institutional formations that are intended towards these goals. And of course, in all of this, what we'll notice, what I would hope you notice is that what they're not doing is trying to destroy the order. They are not actually trying to destroy the order in the absence of US leadership. Rather, they are stepping in to do more and to take on leadership, which is something they have been waiting to do for quite some time. So the notion that these countries are somehow anti-Western or anti-order, as is often presented, is not true. That this is ultimately their revealed preference. If they actually truly didn't like the order and the US had stepped back from it, they could have taken the opportunity to chip away at it and destroy it. In fact, they are taking opportunities to lead. And so in some sense, there's great benefit for them in this order as well. What are the challenges for these countries, right? This has been well documented. BRICS really is, it sometimes it's called China plus plus instead of BRICS because it is really just, on the back of China's economic dominance. And so the presence of one country dominating that kind of grouping can present problems, especially when you have internal rivalries like the China-India border dispute and so on. There are also conflicting priorities over having a global reserve currency, a BRICS currency. India and Brazil have their own relationships with the US that would complicate any major effort to peel away towards a more BRICS-oriented bloc, as it were. The initiatives like the NDB and the CRA are relatively weak compared to existing alternatives. And BRICS itself faces a challenge between representation and effectiveness, which traditional institutions have also faced, which is as you expand, you become more representative, but you also become less effective because it's harder to make decisions in larger groups. And so Even, in a place like the WTO, there used to be the convention of small group decision making, and now as BRICS expands, it will start to face those challenges. And at the core of it also is this notion of who actually speaks for the global south. The global south is such a diverse group of countries that even these countries at the top who are doing well and claim to speak for the global south will face challenges in terms of their ability or inability to represent this diverse set of interests, particularly when Russia is not itself a global south actor and China is increasingly taking on the mantle of a global economic power. Can it credibly claim to be part of the global south? These are important questions. And one that really becomes clear when you take the high income countries out of the picture and even look at just the comparison of per capita GDP between middle and low income countries since the end of the Cold War. You see immediately that middle income countries have actually done remarkably well under the conditions of sort of post Cold War US hegemony and now tending towards bipolarity and so on, whereas low income countries have just stayed stagnant. And within, of course, middle income, there are upper and lower as well, and there are differences there as well. There's a further criticism of an institution like the BRICS, which comes from Jim O'Neill himself, the person who coined the term. And ultimately, so he says that truly global challenges cannot be addressed through narrow groupings like BRICS or even the G7. What we really need is a rejuvenated G20, which was effective during the financial crisis. And it best reflects today's world in all its complexities, right? So, in a sense, if the criticism of BRICS, if the BRICS criticism of the Western order is that it acts like a club that excludes others, the solution may not be to create yet another club. BRICS cannot itself be a club, right? And so there are many things that the BRICS alone cannot do. It has to be more inclusive, but then, of course, if it bridges that gap and bridges the divide between North and South, there are other challenges there because North-South relations have rarely worked out for the global South countries. Those who remember the new international economic order debates of the 70s and 80s will remember that that very important initiative went nowhere, largely because it was stymied by global North countries in venues like the UN. So what happens? This is my final slide. How do we think about the future, right? And here, in a sense, I would say that what looks like from a Western vantage point a crisis of rules-based order is often seen as an opportunity by other countries. It is seen as an opportunity for them to put their case forward, to pursue their interests, and to shore up their status in the international order, to get representation, voice, the things that they have historically lacked. And in this sense, at least the more prosperous and countries among the BRICS and those that are not fighting wars at the moment, and their allies and partners will keep an order alive. It'll keep an order alive. It may not be that liberal order. It may not look like that, but there will be some form of cooperation centered on multilateral institutions and market capitalism of various varieties, because this is actually beneficial for many of these countries. It has worked for them. It has brought them out of poverty and so on. The order will be contested and fragmented. That is, countries, the rising powers within BRICS and the global south themselves do not necessarily get along. You can think of India's own challenges with Pakistan. You can think of Brazil's vying for regional leadership with countries like Argentina. There are other problems regionally. There are other countries in the global south, perhaps, that have their own claims to regional leadership and so on. But there will still be this sort of order of some sort. And within this order, it will be both Russia and the US that stand out as revisionists. It is, in some sense, an inversion of the Cold War, which is that others would prefer the status quo, but a reformed status quo to include more voice and representation, whereas Russia and US are at this moment seen as dismantling whatever exists and being anti status quo. Um, Ultimately, what does this mean for European states? They will find themselves increasingly in the balance. The traditional relationship between the US and Europe is fraying. This opens up opportunities for the BRICS countries to cultivate European states, and European states can therefore act as what we might call swing states in this growing competition for legitimacy, authority, and influence in the international order. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rohan, for a very enlightening lecture, for very interesting points. I'm going to give the floor to Greg, but before I do that, I wanted to quickly ask you, If you could perhaps elaborate a little bit more on the European powers as swing states. Are you thinking of any particular state? I mean, EU is very, with the European countries are very divided and sort of caught in between. Some of them are closer to countries in the global south and so on. So just that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, there's different dimensions to this problem. I think some of them are also, at this point, governed by fairly pro-Russia coalitions, and so there are definitely divisions within Europe itself. But I mean, one can also think of the traditional so-called great powers like France and Britain, who are currently permanent veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council, but are increasingly finding that their influence globally has been declining, right? So France, for example, has recently faced the loss of numerous historical partnerships and relationships in Western Africa, where essentially they have been asked to exit, and Russia and China have sort of stepped in to fill those gaps, as it were, or at least become strategic partners to countries in the region. Britain itself is sort of finding its place in the world at this point, and there is conversation about how one can think about new governance arrangements where room can be made for countries like Brazil, India, and so on. At least the sort of IPSA coalition of South Africa, Brazil, and India creates opportunities for European countries to partner with, because many of the Western European countries at least value the democratic and market-oriented nature of these countries.
Which I think was the case back in December when the Europeans rushed to go to Mercosur. Of course, that hasn't been approved properly, and I think we'll see a few years before that happens, but who knows? Anyway, I'll come back with more questions from the audience and a few from me, but I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Professor Gregory Chin, who is going to be the discussant and is going to provide some comments and some questions. Greg, welcome.
Thank you, Alvaro. And let me just begin by thank you, Rohan, for that excellent presentation. It's excellent on a number of levels. And I'll just offer a few thoughts and then maybe ask if there's time, maybe two questions. I'll start with one question, and if there's time, two questions. Rohan, I thought, I think your presentation captured very nicely how we are living in this kind of this interregnum, from something to something, and you give that global perspective. It's not easy to do this type of global analysis right now when there are so many apparently fundamental shifts going on, and as you, I think, very nicely captured, a lot of what we thought we knew about global order or the global order, whether it's globalization, the way capitalism works structurally, whether it's the role of the state and the relationship between state and capital, right? The retreat of the state. You're at the LSE. Susan Strange famously wrote about the retreat of the state. And just so many of these structural shifts about the balance of power, the traditional powers, the emergence of these new potential rivals or competitors, and then what it has all meant for the global south through it all. The uncomfortable, inconvenient continuity of their their disadvantaged position in the world for the least developed. I think you did a really nice job of showing how so much is like what is changing quite profoundly, but also important continuities, and how this, for especially the least developed countries, the poorest of the poor, and then how this presents fertile ground for the BRICS, and also great difficulty for the G7 and for the US to engage the global south. There's, as you say, I think you're implying there's a bit of a contestation going on between BRICS and the traditional powers over kind of courting the global south. And of course, global south itself is highly contested term. And as you, I think, very nicely indicated, there's a lot of debate about what is global south, including in China. And your take on China, I think, was bang on. It's significant structurally, but also interestingly, inside China, there's a lot of debate between, let's say, people who are more aligned with the position of the party, the the party state who like the global South concept. And then there are the others who study international organization, maybe probably more aligned to the way things have been for a long time, who are uncomfortable inside China with this new alignment with the global South for China. So it's fascinating, even within China, as Alvaro knows well, at the big universities in China, there's a lot of debate over, what is global South and does it matter? Why should it matter? That kind of thing. So thank you for the name of our dialogue here. You've done us a great service in opening up Global South too. Um, yeah, I think we are at this very interesting moment of shift, and where it's overused, often too often said, the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. But I think you did a nice job of identifying some of the new elements, or the elements of this emerging order, in the new patterns and trends, but also, um, yeah, and I think I'm hoping to use this recording for my teaching moving forward. You did such a nice job, Rohan, of really giving us this big picture of global change. Um, just a couple of thoughts building on what you said, and maybe bring us back to Jim O'Neill, as you nicely brought up, and and the role of Trump vis-a-vis the BRICS. Jim O'Neill wrote a very interesting, you probably know, piece for Project Syndicate back in August, where he referred to Trump as the secret weapon for the BRICS. In other words, there's actually a lot of tensions between the BRICS. China, India is one of the obvious ones, but with Trump's kind of seeming attacks on, trade war with India and Brazil and punishing them and this and that, that he's actually driving the BRICS together, giving them additional meaning. And I think Jim, of course, was, being a little bit pointing at the irony of all this. Trump, on the one hand, is probably the only US president who actually talks about the BRICS very much. Even Obama, who recognized maybe we're in a post-American world, didn't really refer to the BRICS that much. But Trump keeps bringing up the BRICS as a threat, a threat to the dollar, as you said, and things like this. And so better not threaten the dollar, and he has. So do you think that despite the challenges of the BRICS, and BRICS Plus, we know that there's been some new tensions, even with new members being brought in, that part of this is how the US is responding to all this. And I think, you've given us the sense of the Trump era, and so my two questions is, do you think Trump is helping to drive the BRICS forward? And whoever follows on Trump as the US president, assuming that it's probably going to be Republican, but could also be Democrat, but in any case, America itself appears to have changed quite profoundly, um, towards, as you say, more thinking about its own national interests, less about global public goods. Do you think that? And yeah, that's the first question. How do you think? Yeah, your thoughts about the Trump effect. I think you're muted, Rohan. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, thank you for your very generous comments, Greg, and for the question. It's a great question. I mean, and of course, Jim O'Neill will be the one to pick up on this, but it is, in a sense, it is being talked about in various places, in especially in light of the recent sort of, it's not, I wouldn't call it a bust up or a flare up, but essentially the decline of the relationship between the US and India, right? Which I think there was great confidence among the Indian leadership when Trump was reelected that they could do business with him because Trump 1.0 was so good for India. But in fact, it's been the opposite. 50% tariffs, the issue of buying Russian oil, the desire to essentially push, and all of this is of course connected in a way because the China has stopped buying several U.S. agricultural products, which then makes the U.S. more keen to push open other markets for its products. And that's one of the big sticking points in negotiations right now between India and the U.S., which has led to this kind of tariff conflict in some ways, which is the market for soybeans and wheat and other products that the US would wish India would buy from them because China no longer buys them. So there is this sort of interconnected nature of this problem. But at a political level, I think Trump has done a great service to champions of BRICS, right? Which is if you talk to sort of colleagues in China, they seem to be more relaxed these days about things like the Quad, things like the future of BRICS, because ultimately for them, in some sense, India was the key to many of these things, right? That it was India's reluctance earlier to be a full-fledged member of the Quad that then changed with growing tensions between India and China on the border between those two countries that gave a sort of fillip to the Quad after 2017 and until recently. And now that things are on the downturn between India and the United States, it gives folks in China optimism that things may be okay from the vantage point of Chinese interests in the region. Having said all of that, I mean, there are still, I think, internal contradictions within BRICS itself. Those will not go away. I think the India-China contradictions are simply you have an undemarcated border. This is something that is virtually impossible to resolve, and very different positions on that, which is to say that one side wants to first demarcate and then negotiate, the other side wants to first negotiate and then demarcate. So there's different positions on this issue. There's also, frankly, it's not unclear to me that the China-Russia relationship is going to be as long-lived and robust as people imagine it to be, given Russia's own goals, which are actually quite different from China's. And this is something that is perhaps not emphasized enough, which is China is much more a beneficiary and a supporter of the existing order than Russia has been, and does not have the same ill will towards that order. It would like to lead it. I don't think it would like to pull it apart the way Russia is doing in many ways. And so there are still those contradictions that won't go away. So yes, in the short term, there will be these uh, sort of beneficial effects from Trump, but the BRICS will have to resolve their own problems before they can actually become a force to be reckoned with.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gregory and Rohan, for the answers. Yeah, I agree with Greg in the sense that this was a fantastic presentation. I also echoing with what he was saying about Trump, sort of bringing more attention to the BRICS, oftentimes misinformed. I mean, he thought Spain was part of the BRICS, which brings me to my question is how do you categorize the BRICS? Because it's a very loose idea. It's not an organization. In my case, Greg and I, we analyzed the New Development Bank. When we were talking about BRICS, in many ways, is whatever you want it to be, because it doesn't have membership and in the sense of an IGO. So it's difficult for the analysts to pinpoint exactly what it is.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like BRICS has many things to many different people, and the new members that have joined are not exactly sort of globally recognized as pro liberal order and so on. Many of them are sort of friends and allies of China, so it does feel like a China-centric club in some sense. But at the same time, I think it that serves its purpose at the moment. It is precisely the looseness of BRICS that allows it to reach out to different constituencies, different coalitions, and build those ties. Essentially, I think it broadly claims to represent the global South. So to the extent that the global South itself is an amorphous construction that serves a political purpose, I think BRICS is the most concrete manifestation of that. So yes, no secretariat and so on, but it is still part of this complex of let's say groupings. It is in a way, the Quad is a bit like that. The Quad Plus is a bit like that. There are these informal coalitions and groupings, issue-based coalitions and groupings that have emerged even on the side of the West to deal with sort of Asian security and other public goods provision in the region. And then, of course, further down the spectrum, you have formalized institutions where China and Russia are more central, like the SCO. So I think there's a spectrum, and BRICS is on that spectrum, and it also at the same time overhangs the entire spectrum because it involves the major actors of the global South. So I don't think necessarily that that's a challenge. It is a challenge, I think, for researchers and analysts, but for those who are accustomed to working in the gaps, in the real world interstices of politics, I think they find it perfectly comfortable. And the global, I mean, the concept of global South is brought up all the time in global South countries as a sort of political rallying point, right? So it's not something that no matter how much we at LSE sit and say that this is a ridiculous concept that somehow does not capture reality, for many people in the global South, it is real. And I think, but at the same time, they acknowledge that it is elastic
Yeah.
and can mean many different things. Yeah.
Completely agree with you. The elasticity of it. I mean, I am the director of the Global South Unit, and Global South countries, some of them identify as the Global South countries. Many of them reject the term, depending who you're talking to. We have 10 minutes left, so what I want to do is open the floor for questions, and we have a few interesting questions which reflect, in a sense, what we already been discussing. We have a question from Mehdi from Oxford, who says, talks about the expansion of the BRICS, including Egypt and Iran. If you could comment on this. I'm going to give you three questions at a time. Um, then a question from Andrew. Andrew, how does the idea of the U.S. Abandoning its hegemony relate to Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again, and his criticism of the BRICS um, as a threat to the U.S. dollar? Could the Global South take on the role of development aid now that the Trump administration is walking away from it? Um, would it be what would be the geopolitical implications of this? I'm going to stop with that.
Okay, so the third question first, right? So,
Sure.
oh, I see. These three questions. Yeah. Maybe I'll just go in the order that they were asked. So, on the expansion of BRICS, I mean, it's in some senses it's a bit early to say what impact this is going to have. I mean, of course, if you look at the countries that have joined, they have pretty diverse interests, but at the same time, they are also countries that are in a way hedging their relationships. Egypt traditionally has had a relationship with the United States, so has the UAE. Saudi Arabia was invited, was on the fence, and still remains on the fence, and has not exactly decided whether it will join or not. Sometimes it's mentioned as a member, sometimes it's not. So, in some sense, I think it precisely reflects that change that Greg was talking about of moving from something to something else. And while we're in that process, there will be this sort of Schrodinger's membership, right? Which is you want to both be in these groups and not be in these groups because you're trying to hedge your relationship with the West. And if Trump calls out BRICS as an anti-Western sort of formation, then those who have traditionally had relations with the U.S. will want to be a bit more careful about their membership. So, really, from the perspective of new members, I think this is a hedging strategy. From the perspective of the BRICS members, especially China, it's a way of sort of building an alternative order. I mean, China is building something that it can rely on as its claim to sort of global ordering in some ways. And you can see a future in which the economic BRICS is largely an economic institution with some sort of public goods functions, and SCO being a security institution can form the pillars of a China-centric order in Asia and beyond, right? That sort of ripples outward from Asia. And so you start with building Asian security and global South economic development, and then it builds into something more global. I mean, that's of course far in the future. So I think watching the membership is important, and who joins in the future will also be important. Um, how does the idea of U.S. abandoning hegemony? Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. Can you make America great again by walking away from hegemony, right? Walking away from being the leader of the global order? Because ultimately, as we've seen, the benefit of the global order has been tremendous for high-income countries, including the United States, and especially the United States, because it has gotten to write rules in its own favor, and it has gotten to sort of benefit it significantly within its Western alliance system. So in some sense, yeah, it's not going to be beneficial for the legitimacy and global leadership of the United States. Tariffs will have to be paid by someone, and it will have to be the American people in a large part. And the costs of all of this will, of course, not be borne by Trump because these things happen in a lagged way, and so his successors will be the ones paying the economic costs of this, or let's say the political economic costs of this. But as far as the question is also linked to the way it's posed is linked to the dollar as well, and there I'm not as certain. I mean, yes, there is this sort of shift away a little bit, certainly a strong desire to move away from the dollar as the reserve currency, but it still remains overwhelmingly the global reserve currency, and it would take a lot to shift that equilibrium away from that. And then the question, of course, opens up as to what that alternative currency would be, which country's currency would be the global reserve, or would it be a BRICS currency? It's there are such divided opinions on this within BRICS countries that it's hard to sort of predict what's going to happen. But certainly, U.S. legitimacy and leadership is eroding as uh, Make America Great Again unfolds both domestically and abroad. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say. On Good look. This is a fascinating question. I mean, Greg's early work on China as a aid giver is, I remember reading that in graduate school and loving it. Like it was I think it was like Chin and Kadir 2013 maybe. I don't know, like that one paper, which was fantastic, right? And really it's, I mean, so absolutely they can take on and they have been engaged in development aid for so long. I mean, many of these countries, especially China, now India in competition with China. And the geopolitical implications are interesting because China and India as aid givers tried to project themselves as non-Western, non-DAC, right, Development Assistance Committee, and essentially say, oh, we actually listen to recipients and we care about South-South solidarity. But actually, they don't, right? They actually pretty much function along similar lines, which is you have to sort of hire contractors from their country, you have to bring in labor from their country. Much of the aid giving is like a circular economy, just as it has been for Western countries. And so for now, rhetorically, there seems to be some geopolitical implication as other countries may take more and more aid from these countries. But the vast majority of Chinese economic engagement is not aid per se. It's actually concessional grants and loans and investments. And I think that's the where the action is. And that's the thing that has geopolitical implications. And in some sense, there has been this commercial empire that has been built along the BRI, which may at some point in the future start to resemble a political empire. But for now, it looks like early British Empire rather than, say, American Empire, right? So it's not a network of bases. It's more a network of trading ports and trading relationships and investments that is spread out across the sort of Eurasian landmass and maritime zones. So future geopolitical implications are possible, but not through the aid route. That would be my answer.
Thank you so much. We have time for three more questions, which I will select here. I think one of them is about, is the Global South just purely construct, as you can see from the Álvaro Aguilo. Lungu is asking a question about China and Latin America. I would ask Lungu to join the next seminar in December, which is a topic that we will be discussing, specifically the impact of China and Africa in Latin America by Chris Alden. And then the question, do you see the BRICS and the broader Global South being able to prepare or strategize more effectively around Trump's unpredictability, which is obviously seen everywhere? Finalizing with, how do you characterize Trump's approach to ASEAN?
Hmm. Yeah, okay. That's a lot of different questions. So, to what extent is it an ideological construct, the Global South? I mean, uh, m- my my understanding of this is it is as ideological or real. I mean, first of all, non-ideological. Sorry, something that's ideological doesn't mean it's not real. And secondly, it's as ideological or non-ideological as things like the third world that came before it, or the concept of developing world, or even the West. I mean, the West doesn't get along either. I mean, if anyone who's read the history of or studied the history of France-US relations will see that you don't have to be friends to be allies and partners, right? I think there's great skepticism on both sides of that relationship that still keeps them in some sort of alignment and within the construct, the umbrella concept of the West. And so I think in that sense, yes, but also so what, right? It is an ideological construct, but I don't think it matters. And yes, which parties in power may or may not be more aligned with that, certainly. I mean, and the more the US frames it as an anti-Western club, the more you will have presidents like Bolsonaro or Milei who may seek to curry favor with Trump and therefore reject that kind of framing. Absolutely. But these are the natural rhythms of the interactions between domestic politics and international politics. I don't think it takes away too much from the broader trend. On Sania's question, do you see BRICS as being able to strategize more effectively around Trump's unpredictability? Um, Not yet. I think everyone is still a bit bewildered. They're not sure what comes next, and it's very difficult to predict. Partly also because Trump himself is now a unit of analysis in international affairs. That is, the US is not, it's hard to predict what the US wants versus what Trump wants. And in
Mm.
some sense, there is that element of unpredictability that is introduced by the personality of the president and those around him. And so the effort then has been, I guess, to the extent that there is a strategy, it is to placate Trump and his advisors rather than to think about US interests. And I think that is what is currently the strategy. On ASEAN, I mean, It's the Professor Yunfeng Kong was at LSE just last week and made a presentation about the alignment choices of ASEAN, and he showed essentially that in the last few years, most ASEAN countries except Vietnam have leaned towards China more than before, and so there's certainly this hedge away from the United States, which was seen as a traditional guarantor, but under Trump is now so unreliable that China seems like a preferable option for now. I don't think ASEAN countries are also permanent in their friendships and alliances. I think they shift around the spectrum, and so for now China feels like a safer bet. China is also presenting itself as a safer bet at this moment. It suits China to say that we're not the unpredictable actors, we're not dismantling global governance, look at what the Americans are doing. So that works for now, but tomorrow things could change. This is a fluid relationship. uh, Trump, I hope, I mean, I don't know how much Trump cares about ASEAN, but frankly, past US administrations have also struggled to care about Southeast Asia. So I don't know if he's that different in that regard. I think the change comes more from ASEAN's own perception of a Trump administration.
Thank you so much, Rohan and Greg. And I want to especially thank the participants for the questions, but also the organizers, Dave and his team for this fantastic opportunity to discuss the Global South under Trump. Rohan, thank you so much for your time. We were honored to have you here for the third session. There will be a YouTube video on this particular seminar, so you can follow it. And as Greg said, he will use it for his students as well. And Greg, thank you so much for joining us again. And please remember that we have a fourth seminar this year on December the 11th on China and Africa and the implications for Latin America. So the question from Lungu could be posed there because this is a very important issue that is happening as we speak. And so thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon, whatever you're doing and wherever you are. Thank you
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.